to the Garrett room in Lard Island, where we've released Dave from the radiator, where we keep him chained up, working on new projects for us. And one of the things he and I have been talking about is producing a video for you so we can cover some of the points of General Dame that you guys have said that you're interested in. So Dave, what are we going to be doing today?
Okay, right, what we're going to do is we're going to have a run through of a General Dame battle, and we'll be examining each phase of the rules as we go through them. So we'll examine deployment, we'll examine skirmishers, we'll examine musketry, we'll examine charges, we'll examine cavalry charges and melees, and we'll have an explanation of not only how do the rules work, but also perhaps some of the tactics that we considered whilst we're employing those troop types.
Okay, sounds fabulous. Well, we've got a beautiful looking game that you've laid out for us. Without further ado, let's take a quick look at that, and then we can come back and hear what we've got to say.
Okay, so what we've got here is we've got a standard 1813-ish battle between, we have the French over there with some Confederation allies, and here we have a combined Austrian and Russian force. So we have some Russian infantry deployed here with artillery, Austrian brigade in reserve, an Austrian infantry brigade up front, then there's some Austrian cavalry supporting them on that flank. They're opposed by the attacking French force, who have 4 infantry brigades. There's 3 up front and 1 to the rear. They've got their supporting artillery, and then they've got their cavalry also deployed over on their flank, opposing the Austrian cavalry. What we're going to do now is look at initial brigade deployment and how this impacts upon our battle plan as the game progresses. So first of all, we'll look at this French brigade's deployment. So here we have our French brigade deployed, ready to assault the Austrian main position. They're deployed in columns, but they're deployed in a checkerboard formation. Why are they deployed like this? For 2 main reasons. First of all, it avoids enemy artillery bounce through and that very important mass columns issue that we have in many Napoleonic war games. By spreading them out, they can support each other, but they don't suffer from mass columns and they don't suffer from bounce through. We also have the skirmish screen to the fore, ready to engage the enemy skirmish screen. Here we have our Austrian brigade deployed for defence. Why are they deployed like this? Well, first of all, they're deployed in 3 lines, as you can see. The initial line is the skirmish line, and we have an infantry battalion defending this village. The main line of resistance for this brigade will be where the 2 Austrian battalions are deployed in line, and then they have a reserve line of the 2 columns at the rear. Why are they deployed like this? For 2 reasons. First of all, by deploying in line, this will lessen the casualties inflicted by French artillery. And while they're deployed in columns at the rear, the second reason is it allows them to either fall back on that reserve line or allows the reserves to come up and reinforce the main line should they need to do so. What I'm going to do now is just give a very brief description of how to use or deploy your ADCs, what taskings to consider and why we should consider putting them on those taskings. Once we have our ADCs for the turn, let's have 4 for this Austrian general available for this turn. He's got 2 basic options before him with ADC taskings and deployment. The first option is to consider deploying a brigade attachment ADC to each of your brigades. And you can do this if you have enough ADCs, or you can put them at where your main effort is going to be. But the reason we do that is to ensure that the army is under command. That does 2 things. It prevents, hopefully, our brigades from going hesitant, and it also means that you have a better chance of maintaining the initiative. The other option we have with ADC taskings is to go for concentration of effort, such as the artillery tasking, going on to assault, glory, etc. these taskings enhance your fighting ability. So one of the things to consider is trying to concentrate our ADC effort within one brigade, because what you'll find is you won't be able to do all those taskings across multiple brigades. So for instance, if we wanted to put this brigade battery onto artillery assault, that will require 2 ADCs to do so. However, we want to concentrate our effort on this brigade. So let's give it an ADC brigade attachment as well, because what that will do is reinforce the chances of success, which means that our artillery assault is more likely to go forth and do the damage. If we spread, and we don't put him there, and we spread our ADCs more thinly, then there's a chance that the brigade could go hesitant, and therefore we're wasting our effort. So hence, one of the main things to consider with ADC taskings is to concentrate your effort at the main point of focus. Okay, the ADCs have now been deployed and the battle is moving forward. And we move next to skirmishers and the considerations around skirmish screens. First of all, what is the purpose of our skirmish screen? I would suggest it has 2 main functions. First of all, to overcome the enemy skirmishers, and then secondly, to harass and weaken the enemy formations where possible. And of course, the defender, his option with skirmishes is to prevent that, is to drive off the enemy skirmishers so they can, and wear down or attrite the attacker's assault columns. So, what we have here is a French skirmish screen opposing an Austrian skirmish screen. As you can see, we have the French skirmishers here opposing the Austrian skirmish line. So what are the options available to our French player? Well, his skirmish screen doesn't massively outnumber the Austrian skirmishers. So if he's going to win the skirmish combat, he will probably need to consider the skirmish tasking, which increases his firepower and allows battalions to reinforce the line. Or his other option is to use his light infantry, and this here is a light infantry regiment deployed on the right, to assist that skirmish line by going into skirmish order. So let's take that option and let's deploy these French into a skirmish line to assist the original skirmishers. By doing that, we've greatly increased the French skirmish firepower. That then puts the Austrian skirmishers on the back foot. How can the Austrians reply to this if they want to avoid being defeated in the skirmish combat? Well, this brigade has no light infantry, so it actually only has one option available to it, other than withdrawing the skirmishers and accepting you've lost. He could reinforce the skirmish line by using the skirmisher tasking, using one of his infantry battalions. He could, say, take this one, use a skirmisher tasking and reinforce the skirmish line, which would give him about equal numbers with the French skirmishers. However, of course, that means that this battalion is permanently lost to the brigade and will weaken not only the brigade itself, but also his reserve line, because it will go down to just one battalion. So those are the tactical options you need to consider. Do you want to win the skirmish combat? If so, we need to put more men into it. If we're going to accept that we'll just take as many casualties as we can before ceding the skirmish phase, then don't reinforce. Those are generally the options you have. And one of the other tactics to consider with skirmishers is that they are very useful for either holding a line or holding in front of a brigade that has suffered a major reverse. So for instance, if you had an attack in columns that had gone in and failed, they could then fall back behind a heavy skirmish line and just stay there. Here we have an example of taking the battle forward where we've had 2 French columns have tried to assault the Austrian line and been repulsed with quite heavy casualties. So the option that you can do with skirmishers is to throw forward a large heavy skirmish screen to protect the remnants of your brigade. Don't be tempted to try another assault with columns that have taken very heavy casualties, because it will probably go wrong. But if you feed as many additional reinforcements into the skirmish line as possible, that will present a heavy line that is capable of dealing with the enemy, even if it means gradually giving ground. It's similar to the tactic that d'Erlon did at Waterloo and that the French used in many other battles, so it's worth considering. What we're going to do now is look at a single battalion executing an assault upon a village or a built-up area held by the enemy, and we'll see that on the table here. So we have here our single French battalion assaulting this village held by Austrian infantry. Now, what we do with all charges is we move up to the 5 centimetre point, and I have here a very handy implement that will clearly delineate where 5 centimetres is. Oh, look at that, they've crept forward a bit too soon. And at the 5 centimetre point, the Austrian garrison can fire. As a rule note, all garrisons fire as skirmishers. So they will use the normal casualty dice to fire with, and this is an average size garrison and will fire with 3 dice. If they cause any casualties, these are noted on the battalion. So let's say that 1 casualty is caused from that fire. If a discipline test is caused by the garrison, which would be represented by a double 6, then the column would need to take that discipline check before moving in. Once all that is resolved, the column is then simply moved into melee with the garrison. You'll note that there's no of the charge procedure that normally happens. We just ignore that and we go straight to melee. So don't be tempted to go through the charge procedure, just move your column straight into contact. Right, let's now move to one of the most important aspects of the game, the actual charge to try and dislodge the enemy or get into melee. What I'm going to describe when we move to the battle is the French attack against the Austrian brigade. But there are things you need to consider before launching your assaults. The first thing is you're launching an infantry assault. Make sure that the assault order has been in place well beforehand so that your assaulting brigade doesn't need to hang around in the dangerous area waiting for the order to get through. It's already on assault and it's already moving up. However, don't be tempted to charge in straight away against a fresh opponent unless you outnumber him significantly or you're much better quality troop types. Be prepared to wear him down with your skirmishers, with long-range artillery, ensuring that you're continually attriting his battalions, and perhaps even consider a volley before you go in. But the thing about volleying before you charge is if you have a fire discipline result, which is not good, your charge won't be able to go in the following phase because you have to stop, which is why Marshal Ney and the other aggressive marshals ordered their troops to take their flints out of their muskets so they couldn't stop to fire. It's a tactical option for you to consider before charging home. Now we'll move to our battle where we have our French brigade declaring a charge upon the defending Austrian brigade. You'll see here that the French brigade has decided to deploy its lead battalion in line and have 2 supporting columns on both flanks. The Austrians are deployed in line. This is the target unit up front and it has the supporting line on its flank. Casualties are represented by these casualty dials that we're using here. The French player had decided to hold off his initial charge to cause some more casualties upon the Austrian battalions, to attrite them further to assist him in his breakthrough in his charge. Of course, in the process, he's also taken some casualties, but that's the trade-off you need to consider when holding back and trying to reduce your enemy. So, we'll now move to the charge itself. The French battalions and line have moved up to the 5 centimetre point and have declared this Austrian unit as the target unit. So, the Austrian unit now fires, and also the Austrian unit on the flank can also fire. However, note that the supporting Austrian unit can't actually hit this one, it will be hitting this flank column. So therefore, the casualties caused won't affect the target unit. That's worth considering when charging in. Now let's do the dice rolls for the charge. Okay, we have 9 for the French and 5 for the Austrians. So, what is the consideration for the Austrian? Clearly, he has a support and allows him a reroll. He's got to reroll that 1. So, initially, the French will pass any reroll because they're more than happy with their 9. So the Austrian will reroll, hoping for a lot better than 1. Okay, not the best roll for him. So, let's just work through the modifiers that we have here. The French are on 9. This is a veteran battalion and the general is attached, taking them up to their status of elite. So that will add another 2 to their score. However, they took 2 casualties from the Austrian line when they charged home, which is a -1. So that will be knocked back down to just 1. That'll take their total score to 10. None of the other modifiers apply. And if you actually look through the charge columns on the charge table, you'll see that on the left-hand side, most of those modifiers actually apply to cavalry. In the central one under formations, again, most of that formation applies to cavalry or infantry squares. So you can skim through those first 2 columns quite quickly, just checking that nothing applies, and move to the important column, which is the casualty column over on the right. So let's move now to the Austrians. They've rolled 6. This Austrian battalion is classed as line and the general is also attached, so that will give them an extra +1, taking them up to veteran. However, the French had caused them casualties. They're currently holding 5, which is a -1 on the casualty status, so they'll drop back down to 6. So there we have a score of 10 for the French versus 6 for the Austrians. A significant victory. The attacker will take the ground and the defender will retreat, taking 1d3 casualties. Now the Austrian support, bear in mind, doesn't retreat, it will retire with the lead unit and it will take just 1 casualty. So that Austrian line must retreat and the support that was with it must retire. Now the only other option that the Austrian battalion could have done was to move up one of his reserves to the 5 centimetre point behind his line to give them another support. But the disadvantage with that is if you're throwing in all your brigade and you lose, as they've done here, you've got virtually nothing left to defend with. But at least the Austrians now have a reserve line which they can fall back behind and hopefully stop the French with that. So, the result of that charge was that the French brigade was successful. It's now moved up and taken the ground occupied by the original Austrian battalions. The Austrians have fallen back, their main unit is retreating and their support is retiring. But because the Austrians had a reserve line, they can fall back in relative safety to behind those formations. And hopefully their last reserve line will be able to hold off the French attack. Now we'll take a look at musketry and some of the rules covering musketry fire and some of the issues that you can encounter, especially if you're firing with columns in this period under the rules. So here we have the 2 Austrian columns that have moved up to engage the French. Now, the thing to note about firing in columns is the fact you always fire on the inferior volley line. and you'll round down any half casualties. So fire from columns is pretty ineffective, and this is something you might want to consider if you plan a charge. As we mentioned before, if you roll poorly, you could get a fire discipline result, which will mean your men will halt and won't be able to charge in the next phase. So if you're attacking with columns, think carefully about how much musketry you actually want to engage in, or perhaps just rely on your skirmishers to be chipping away and causing those extra casualties, and don't fire with your columns and make sure that they do charge in the following turn. Okay, what we're going to do now is go through some musketry. The Austrian player has decided that his columns have moved up and he will fire. He's desperate to inflict some casualties on the French attack, and so he can counter-attack and drive it back. Let's see how that goes through. So here we have our two Austrian columns that have moved up, and they've decided they're going to fire to try and inflict casualties before counter-attacking in the following turn. So the first Austrian column has moved up and it will roll the dice. Right, it scored a low 4 result, which is not what the Austrian wanted. So if we go through the modifiers, we will find that actually this is a line battalion. Most of the modifiers don't apply. It hasn't taken any casualties, it's not elite, etc. So we can skim through the modifiers pretty quickly. The only thing, of course, that is important to it is that it will fire using the inferior volley line because it's a column. So if we look at the inferior volley line on a 4, there's no other modifiers applying, it's a FD or fire discipline result. So we'll mark this column with some smoke to indicate the fact it suffered fire discipline. Basically, the officers have lost order and discipline and can't keep control of the battalion, who've now stopped to engage in a firefight. Let's now fire with the second column and see what we get. Okay, a 10. That's the result the Austrians were looking for. So that's a good volley from that column. So again, a quick check through the modifiers. No significant modifiers will apply. It's a lined unit, hasn't taken any casualties, it's still fresh, etc. Of course, the only thing that still applies is the fact that it will fire as an inferior volley because the battalion moved up, and because it's in column, and because it's in column on its reduced frontage, it fires at half effect. So if we look across the inferior volley line on a score of 10, that gives us 3 and a discipline test. So we halve the 3 result because we're in column down to 1.5, which drops to 1 because columns ignore all halves. So they've inflicted 1 casualty and a discipline test, which is important for the Austrians. All discipline tests are taken immediately. So the French will immediately take their discipline test. They've rolled an 11. They shrug it off. If a target was required to take multiple discipline tests, let's say this one had actually had a good score and required a discipline test, you would take as many discipline tests as the casualty chart indicates. However, you will only take the worst result. So if they had to take another one, let's say they take 8, they would always take the lower result. So if you have to take 2 or 3 discipline tests in a turn, you just take 2 or 3. We're now going to move to a cavalry charge involving 2 brigades of opposing cavalry, and we're going to take through the way a charge is executed, some of the tactics to consider, and whether perhaps you should be throwing in your entire cavalry brigade, or perhaps keeping 1 or maybe more units in reserve. So we'll go through this now. Now let's move back to the battle, and we can see our 2 cavalry brigades here that have moved out to engage each other. So what are the considerations when engaging enemy cavalry? First of all, we need to consider the formations we're in. We can either be in line or we can be in column. The disadvantage of cavalry being in column is the fact that they're more susceptible to casualties from artillery fire. But their advantage is they're more manoeuvrable and they can squeeze into smaller gaps. Whereas a line, here we have a double line, is less manoeuvrable and of course takes up a lot more room. So we move to the French Brigade. They've adopted a similar formation. They've got one dragoon regiment in line and a supporting column. However, the French have the advantage that they have one unit of hussars in reserve. The options for the dragoon commander are to commit them, so the whole brigade is committed into action, or to keep them back as a reserve. So perhaps the more prudent tactic would be to keep this unit back in reserve. And probably the best formation for that is a single line. This does two things. If the French dragoons are defeated, they will have a unit to fall back on, fall behind, and offer them some safety, especially if they are routed. Secondly, by forming a line, you cover a much larger area and prevent the cavalry breaking through. Also, if he decides only to attack you with one unit that's on a narrow frontage, you benefit from having a much wider frontage than him and therefore might gain an advantage in the charge. Right, we'll now move to the charge phase and see how the melee goes. Now we move the French cavalry into the charge. They move up to the 5 centimetre point. Now, as you'll have noted, the French have decided to use, in the ADC phase, a glory tasking for their commander. Why? Because this gives an extra dice in the melee. You can attach generals to units as they charge in to increase their morale and assist them to get in, but that doesn't increase their fighting capacity. So even if they're attached in melee, you won't gain a bonus. The only way to gain a bonus in melee is to have played the glory ADC tasking, which effectively means your general's moved out to the front and is fighting in the front rank. That way you will gain an additional +1 in the melee. So we take the two opposing die rolls for the standard closed combat to see what happens. The result is 9 for the Austrians and 9 for the French. Neither have taken any casualties, none are elite or anything particular, they're all graded as line units. The only difference between the two, and this is an important one to note, is the fact the French dragoons are classed as campaign cavalry, whilst the Austrian lead unit, this hussar unit, is battle. As a consequence, the French will lose -1 as they are facing a better quality cavalry, which will take them down to 8. However, that doesn't actually affect the outcome, which means, although the French charged, it permits the Austrians to close into melee. So a melee will take place at this point. Okay, done. Okay, we've now fought the melee and come to a conclusion which the French cavalry have managed to win. But how did we get to that situation? Well, in a melee, each unit has its own dice and applies the modifiers to it. So for instance, this French dragoon regiment would gain the standard 5 dice. The only modifiers that will apply to it, as it's a line unit, is the attached general with glory giving him an extra dice. They don't have any casualties, etc., so nothing else will apply, so they will roll 6 dice. The supporting dragoon regiment, also in melee, rolls its 5 dice. No other situation apply, so it would stay on 5 dice. Note, of course, that in melee, the difference between campaign cavalry and battle cavalry doesn't exist. That has already been applied in the charge, so they've had that advantage. Once those two types of cavalry close to melee, there's no bonus. Of course, there are bonuses for distinctly better cavalry, such as heavy cavalry, etc. So the result of our melee is that the French dragoons won and the Austrian cavalry were forced to retreat. There's one aspect that we just need to consider here. The Austrian commander threw in his entire brigade, leaving him no reserve whatsoever, whilst the French kept a reserve back here. The implication of that is that if the Austrians had been routed, they would have no one to fall back on, no friendly unit to give them support, and they would disperse and leave the table. The French player, having the advantage of the extra number, an additional cavalry regiment, have that support. So if things had gone badly wrong for the French and they had routed, they would have a unit to fall back behind, and therefore they might be able to regroup and rally and fight again later in the battle. Committing an entire brigade without any reserve is a risky strategy. Sometimes it can pay off, other times it can go badly wrong, but it is worth considering before committing your cavalry brigade. Here, I'm just going to show another example of a cavalry melee involving the whole French brigade of 3 units closing in on the Austrian cavalry with one of the supports off to the flank and not lined up with an enemy unit. So we'll take you through that now. In this example, the French Dragoon Regiment with its hussars have decided to be committed as one whole brigade. They've decided not to have the reserve, take a risk and throw their whole weight forward. So here we have Dragoon Regiment and supporting Hussar Regiment over here. The lead regiment is the Dragoons in column, Hussars on that flank, Dragoons on the other. Now, the issue to bear in mind here is that if these units close to melee, and we'll put them closing to melee, have the Austrians closing in, the Hussars don't fight in the initial round of melee. Why? Because they don't have a unit that directly opposes them. And what they can't do in the charge is change direction or wheel. They can wheel at the start, but once they're committed, they can only go straight forward. And as they have no one opposing them, they simply remain in position at this point and the melee is resolved. However, if there is a second round of melee, this regiment can reinforce. It's within the support distance of 10 centimetres for 50mm figures. It's there and it can support. So should there be a second round, the French have an additional regiment to feed in. So that covers a unit that isn't opposed directly by an enemy unit charging into melee. What we're going to now is look at an infantry melee against a village defended by infantry. So if you recall earlier, we had a French battalion attack the Austrian held BUA, and what we'll do now is work through that and show how reinforcements can be fed in. So here we have our village defended by our Austrian garrison, being attacked by a single battalion of French infantry. If you recall, there was no charge procedure. The infantry just moved straight in after the garrison defensive fire, and then we just resolved the issue in the melee phase. So the points to consider here are: the attacker, when meleeing against a village or a built-up area, will always lose 1 dice. The defender fights as normal, either with 5 dice, or if he has casualties, it could be modified downwards. So the initial advantage lies with the defender. The melee table is skewed so that there's a potential for a second round of melee. This is deliberate, as melees around built-up areas and villages tended to go on for quite some time, with numerous reinforcements often being fed in. So how do we do that here? Well, the Austrian player has moved up 2 grenadier battalions to support the village. In order to support, he must be within the support distance of 5 centimetres, again for 50mm figures, so he can feed them in. So in the movement phase, you'll need to move up to the appropriate support distance. It doesn't matter that a column can wheel or is at an angle, as long as they're within that support distance, they can be fed in. And the other important aspect to consider is that as the defender, you do not need to be on assault to reinforce with one or more battalions. You have the option to do that. And the same with the attacker. You don't need to be on assault to reinforce with another battalion. So you can choose either 1, 2 battalions to reinforce with. Right, let's fight the actual melee. Our French battalion gets 5 dice as its standard allotment of casualty dice, but of course loses the one for attacking a village or built up area for the first round. So we have the 4 dice, we're looking for 4+ to score. It's a poor roll for the French, 1 casualty. The Austrians get 5 dice, they have no other modifiers that make any difference, so they roll the 5 dice. Well, look at that. That is a resounding victory. Every one a hit. Bit of revenge for the Austrians. Okay, what the thing to note there is that from village melees or villages or built up area melees, you do not rout. So even though the French have lost by 4 casualties, they don't rout. They'll just simply retreat. So the French will take their 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hideous casualties and retreat. The Austrians will take 1 and go unformed because they fought a round of melee. It's important to note that although the French have retreated, they don't take any additional casualties for falling back. They always just take the melee casualties. The Austrian reserves, well, they didn't need to be committed, but they were there should it have gone to a second round.
Okay, so there we have it. Dave, thanks very much. That was a very, very comprehensive playthrough, and I think that's given us all an opportunity to see some of those situations where we thought, yeah, I'm sure I'm getting this right, but I'd just love to hear it from the horse's mouth. And let's face it, what a better horse's mouth than young David here. So that's all for this show. If you've got any other things you'd like to see us cover in a video format or just asking a general question, please do so. Let us know on the forum and we can try and address those issues. What we want to do is get back soon and play a game through to give you an opportunity of seeing the whole thing happening in anger. So look forward to that on this channel very soon. So thanks for watching.